Thank you very much. Lovely to be here with you all. And it's great to be here with Michael Pollan. Michael, very distinguished journalist and explorer. Your last book, How to Change Your Mind, really changed our minds and did probably more than any other book to shift public perceptions around psychedelics and helped to instigate this rapid reevaluation of these substances. So it's great to have you with us here, Michael.
Oh, thank you, Jules. Pleasure to be here and in the Royal Institution, sort of, where I have fond memories of speaking in person when that book came out, and also to be with you and continue this conversation we've been having for a while.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to talk about your new book, This Is Your Mind on Plants, which explores how humans like to change their consciousness in various ways, particularly by consuming plants. In the book, you look at and you try an upper, a downer, and an outer. So coffee and tea is the upper, poppies is the downer, and then mescaline and peyote is the outer. So we'll look at these one by one, but I'd like to start, if I may, just with some general questions. By the way, for the audience, we're going to talk for about an hour and then take your questions for the last 30 minutes. So, of course, when we talk about altering our consciousness with plants and drugs, that sounds illicit and fringe and you know, a bit from the underworld. But your point is that it's actually completely normal and human to want to change our consciousness with plants.
Yeah, this appears to be a universal drive, like the drive to reproduce and find food and survive. It's been there was a survey done in the 70s, and they found that you know, the overwhelming majority of cultures had some plant or fungus they used to change consciousness. This could be alcohol, this could be coffee and tea, or it could be something more radical like a psychedelic. And it's a very curious, the one exception to this, by the way, were the Inuit in Greenland. And the only reason was nothing psychoactive grew where they lived. And as soon as alcohol was introduced, they took to it, like just about everybody else. And it's a curious desire because on its face, it would seem to be maladaptive in that when you change your consciousness, at least in, you know, radical ways, you're more prone to accidents. You're more vulnerable to being preyed upon. You're defenseless. And so you would have thought that evolution would have edited out the drug takers by now, if that were the case. But in fact, they're going strong. And that suggests that there is probably some value. And you can imagine some of these values. I mean, the relief of pain is a big deal, right? I mean, and, you know, humans have been using opiates for thousands of years to do that. At a time when medicine offered very little in the way of cures, relieving pain was the main thing that doctors could do for you. And obviously, it's very adaptive to have tools to limit pain. I think relief from boredom is another. You know, we're just not satisfied with the world as it presents itself to us always. But I came to think that it had other values too, and that I think that a lot of drugs are kind of pro-social, and they, in the proper doses, they make us a little less egotistical and separate feeling, and a little more, you know, melded with the group, with the community. And we are very social beings. We cannot survive without other people, as much as we like to mythologize our independence. And, you know, alcohol is a great example. At low doses, it tends to lubricate social situations and make people get along better until they don't. And then the psychedelics, I think, have a value, particularly in times of crisis. I think that they're I describe them in the book as mutagens, in a sense, parallel to what radiation does to the genome, you know, causing mutations, a very small percentage of which turn out to be useful to the individual or the species. In the realm of culture, drugs mutate memes and create new memes. And the encounter of these powerful molecules with certain minds, brings insights and in discoveries and new metaphors and new theories. And there's a long history of people who, artists and scientists who have testified to the fact that it was during certain drug experiences that they had key insights. So I think that, and visions too, that have perhaps informed religion, the earliest, many religions are based on a mystical experience of an individual reported back to the group. So I think that they've played a really important role. Hard to document all of it, obviously, but there it is. So I think that, we tend to look down on consciousness change as escapist. But I don't think that's the right word for it, because it's often very hard work. And, psychedelics, I don't think of as escapist. I think it's too intense, that, and you actually, you confront things, you don't escape them very often. And
I suppose
so
it's kind of impossible not to take mind-altering substances. Everything we eat alters us in some way or other. So,
think about sugar, right? Sugar has drug-like effects, especially on children. That is the childhood drug of choice. And food, what we eat changes our mood in all sorts of subtle ways. And then there is this amazing psychoactive, caffeine, that 90% of us are involved with on a daily basis. And so we're functioning on an altered consciousness most of the time. And and it's, for many of us, certainly for me, it's default consciousness.
So if this is a natural, normal thing that we all do, that's relevant, of course, for our attitude to drugs, for our policies around drugs. It means that the expression "don't do drugs" is meaningless. Do you think, are you hopeful that this very damaging century-long war on drugs that America has waged on its own people and on other countries as well, that we might really be nearing the end of it?
Well, I think we have a ways to go, but I definitely think it's on the wane. I think that in this country, at least, voters have expressed their desire to end the drug war quite dramatically in 2020 and in a handful of elections since. In 2025, more states, 4 of them traditionally red, voted to legalize cannabis. New York State then followed and legalized cannabis. So now there are 18 or 19 states where cannabis is completely legal and sold in stores. And then another 18 where medical cannabis is legal. But we had some more radical things happen too in that election. The state of Oregon, voters there by a significant margin, like 10-point margin, voted to decriminalize all drugs. People, even people arrested for charges involving cocaine or heroin, will not be incarcerated. They will be moved into drug treatment programs. Small amounts of any drugs will not be prosecuted. And in a separate ballot initiative, the voters of Oregon voted to legalize psilocybin therapy. This, in an amazing measure that actually obliges the State Department of Health to train and certify guides or facilitators for psychedelic experience and licenses growers of magic mushrooms. So in 2023, you'll be able to go to Oregon and have a legal guided psychedelic experience. That's pretty amazing. And then we've had 5 or 6 cities around the country decriminalize what are called entheogens. This is an alternative word for psychedelics that stresses their spiritual value. And this includes Washington, D.C., Oakland, California, Santa Cruz, California, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Denver, Colorado. And this movement to decriminalize plant medicines, they don't even use the word drug, this movement, is taking off around the country. So I think the voters are ahead of the politicians who are a little afraid to give it up. But the drug war has really been exposed as a failure. the modern drug war, which, I mean, yes, we've been warring against drugs for 100 years, but the modern drug war really dates to President Nixon in 1970, when in 1970 was the year that the Controlled Substances Act was passed and psychedelics were made, Schedule 1, the most serious criminal activity. And, it hasn't reduced drug consumption. The drugs have won the drug war, basically. And the collateral damage has been so terrible. I mean, from, the incarceration of people of color, the drug war has really fallen most heavily on them. And we have jails, we have the biggest jail system in the world, and a very high percentage of people are there for drug crimes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and the destruction of countries in Latin America.
Yes, because of the empowerment of the cartels. I mean, the fact that drugs are illegal and the demand hasn't gone away has essentially funded the rise of cartels that are undermining the government of Mexico, have undermined the government of Colombia. It's been a disaster for South and Central America. And the violence in these cultures as a result is awful. But, the other thing that happened, I think, that people saw was that the drug war was sold to us as a public health campaign, right? There were these drugs that were destroying young minds. But in fact, the biggest public health crisis tied to drugs in the last 50 years arose from legal opiates, from Purdue Pharma's marketing of Oxycontin, an opioid, as supposedly a safer, less addictive opiate, which it wasn't. This led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, 93,000 last year alone, more than died from auto accidents in America. And so this scourge of opiate addiction and overdose was driven by not from illicit drugs, but from licit drugs, and I think that's eroded the credibility or hollowed out the credibility of the drug war in the eyes of most people. So I think we will end it. I think it'll be messy and complicated. I wrote a piece for the Times a couple of weeks ago about what, if the drug war is going to end, what does the drug peace look like? And that's a very complicated thing, because it's a lot easier to just say no. But then when you say yes, you have to say yes under certain circumstances. What's the best cultural container for some of these substances? We're going through that process with psychedelics right now. What's the best way to use them? How will you regulate them as drugs? Who else should have access to them? A whole host of very interesting cultural questions come up now as the drug war ends. And I think that's going to be really important work for the culture in the next few years, to figure out the right container for each of these powerful tools.
So you say that in the book, you talk about how humans have co-evolved with certain plants in a kind of symbiotic way. There's a great sentence: the flowers that gave people the most pleasure were the ones that produced the most offspring. Could you unpack for us that idea of the coevolution of certain plants with the human species?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a subject I've been writing about since a book I published in 2001 called The Botany of Desire. And in that book, I was looking at domesticated plants. I looked at 4 different domesticated plants: tulips, potatoes, cannabis, and apples. It's been a while. And the idea for the book grew out of a little epiphany I had as a gardener, where a lot of my work originates. I'm a pretty passionate gardener. And I was planting potatoes, potato seed, and in the very week that the apple trees in my vegetable garden were just buzzing with activity, that they were in full bloom and the honeybees were all over them. And as I sat there planting, it occurred to me that I was more like the honeybees than I realized, or than we generally realize. The honeybee kind of assumes that it is getting the best of its relationship with the apple. It's breaking in, it's stealing the nectar, and it has no idea that it's being manipulated to do that, and that the plant is dusting its legs with pollen on its way in and out. And the bee basically moving the genes of this apple tree around the neighborhood. And I realized, well, how is that different between me and the potato? I think I'm getting the benefit of growing potatoes and this wonderful food. But in fact, the potatoes have induced me to order these seeds, have them delivered, plant them, give them new habitat, expand their range. And so that sent me down this path of looking at the symbiosis of or coevolution. And I give plants a lot more credit, I think, than some people do for having agency and a point of view. I'm not saying they're conscious, but they have a set of goals, as we do, evolutionary goals. And they, a certain subset of them have prospered immensely by hitching their wagon to ours. That when cannabis figured out, and I use those words advisedly, that by changing human consciousness, it could get its genes out of the area in Asia where it originated, India, China, I forget exactly where it was, and spread all over the world and get a level of attention and a tailor-made habitat that it never would have. Coffee and tea are also very good examples. By changing our consciousness, they benefited enormously. And we now give tens of millions of acres to coffee and to tea. And millions of humans spend their lives tending to the welfare of these plants. So, who benefits more? And I would say it's a pretty equal exchange. But I don't know what the plants would say. I mean, I think they'd be laughing.
Because we have this expression, that guy's using drugs, but from your perspective, the drugs are using us.
Yes. Yeah. I think we are, when you mow your lawn and you keep your lawn at 2 inches or whatever it is, you may think you're subordinating these poor grasses, but this is exactly what they want you to be doing, because they're competing with trees for sunlight. And trees are the death of lawns. So every time you mow, you're keeping trees from growing in that piece of land. It's returned to forest. And that is exactly what the grasses want you to do.
So do you think there's a possibility that magic mushrooms or ayahuasca are giving us these shiny epiphanies that we just can't help but go and tell everyone about, just as a way of spreading their DNA, that the joke's on us?
Well, it may be. I mean, ayahuasca is still pretty much 2 wild plants. I don't know how domesticated. I'm sure there's been some selection that's gone on. Magic mushrooms, though, no doubt, we have moved them around the world. There's not a lot of breeding. There's some, but compared to the grasses, the edible grasses, for example, that have been really transformed by our attention, magic mushrooms, we've benefited basically by the ones that got people high were the ones that got moved around the world. And every time you pick a mushroom, you're trailing fairy dust of spores and you don't even know it. I remember searching for psilocybes with Paul Stamets, the great mycologist, for how to change your mind. And we went up to this state park in either Oregon or Washington, I can't say. And we went looking for them, a place he knew that they would come up at a certain point. And I was really struck by the fact that we didn't have to go very far from the campground or the parking lot to find them. And he said, oh, yes, one of the indicator species for psilocybes are Winnebagos, RVs. And what he meant was, people go out there and gather and then concentrate in this one area where their campsites were and had dropped lots of spores. And we've moved them all over the world. We thought for a time that you had to go to Mexico to get magic mushrooms. And then they found them in Washington State and Oregon. And, they're in many, many places. Were they originally? Probably not. I think we have been the vector of their spread around the world.
It's both an evolutionary idea and a somewhat shamanic idea as well, of a kind of relationship with plants, a kind of contract. And you also quote Paracelsus's idea, the idea of the pharmacon, that word meaning both an antidote, is it, and also a poison?
A poison and an ally. It
Right.
basically captures, this was the Greek word for drugs, pharmakon. And there's a lot of wisdom in it because it recognizes that drugs are not all one thing or all another, that they are blessings and they can be curses. And that the same substance that can give people great pleasure can kill them. And it's Paracelsus who says the dose makes the poison. And it's not just dose, it's intention, it's setting, it's context. All these things go into determining whether that relationship with the drug will be constructive or destructive. There's a third meaning of pharmakon too, which is very interesting, which is scapegoat. And these are substances certainly that we've scapegoated. We blame a lot of problems on them. An addiction is typically blamed on the opiate or the cocaine or the alcohol, but of course there's a lot of causes behind an addiction. 5 people exposed to the same drug will not all get addicted. So why will one and not another? Well, it has to do with that person's life circumstances. But we tend to blame the drug automatically. But I always keep that in mind, that there are real ambiguities here. And our tendency is to either over-romanticize drugs, and you're seeing a lot of that in this psychedelic renaissance right now, or to demonize them. And in both cases, without sufficient sensitivity to the fact that it's both. We have to be able to keep some contradictory ideas in our head.
I don't know if you've read a wonderful book by Stefan Bayer called Singing to Plants.
No.
But it's a study of Amazon shamanism. Brilliant book. And the shamans he interviews says that every plant ally also has a kind of shadow side, a dark side. There's no such thing as a totally benevolent kind of plant. They all have dangerous properties as well.
Well, a lot of the things we call drugs are alkaloids evolved by plants to protect themselves. They're pesticides. And that's an interesting fact too, that, even caffeine, beloved by our species, and it turns out a couple other species, the plant produced this to protect itself from insects and also keep other things from growing around it. It's herbicidal. And what's curious about that, and I write about a little bit in This Is Your Mind on Plants, is why should you go to the trouble of producing this complicated neurochemical, basically, something that affects the mind of animals, when you just want to kill them, or you should just want to kill them? And it occurred to me, and this is not, I don't know that I can prove this scientifically yet, but if the pesticides produced by plants were lethal at small doses to everything, it would select for resistance among the pest population. And we know this from our own pesticides. The lethal ones select pretty quickly for resistant members of the pest population, rendering them useless. How much more clever to just kind of discombobulate the mind of your pest, make your pest forget where it saw you or forget what it's doing. And almost all these drug alkaloids, and cannabis is a different category because it's not true of cannabis, but all of them, caffeine, mescaline, and opium, ruin your appetite. You don't want to eat. And that's also perfect if you want to, protect yourself against a pest. I came to understand this years ago because I had a cat named Frank who had a major catnip issue, and he loved catnip, and I kept catnip in my vegetable garden, which was fenced off, so I had to let him in. And every evening when I'd go down to the garden in the summer to pick a salad, he would follow me in, and he'd look up at me, and he clearly had forgotten where the catnip was every day. And I actually had to show him where this plant was. And then he would roll in it and get completely wrecked. And to the extent that he forgot where this plant was. And I thought, that's pretty brilliant on the part of the plant. Mess with his, this again needs a controlled trial, but that's my theory.
Excellent. Let's dig into the 3 plants then. So if we start with the chapter on poppies and opium, this grew out of an article you wrote in the early 90s, in which you about your experience growing poppies. And originally when it came out, it was edited a lot because you were worried this was going to end up put you in prison and you'd lose your house and your life would be wrecked by it. So tell us a bit about that. What happened? You hopefully you didn't end up in prison.
No, I didn't, thank God. But I did have to censor myself and always felt bad about that and tried to correct that with this republication of that essay. So what happened was I was writing gardening columns for the New York Times Magazine mostly and Harper's Magazine. I was a freelance writer, and my editor sent me a copy of an underground press book called Opium for the Masses, written by a writer named Jim Hogshire. And in this book, he explained that you could produce your own opium at home, that Papaver somniferum, which any of the gardeners in this audience know well, a beautiful flower, very easy to turn into narcotic tea or laudanum, a tincture with alcohol. And that these plants grew from seeds that were legally available, or plants you could buy in a nursery. And there was really not much to it. And, we had been kind of trained to think that opium had to be grown in Afghanistan or Turkey and in places with like armies of 10-year-olds who could slit all the pods, and it was a very onerous production. In fact, it had been grown widely in the United States. The Shakers grew it in upstate New York and sold it. And in the South, it was grown to help with the war effort during the Civil War. But the government has been quietly trying to discourage people from growing opium poppies for a very long time. And this book alarmed them. So I decided, this would be a cool column. Let me see if I can grow opium in my garden, and I'll write a column about it. I start corresponding with Jim Hogshire, asking him for horticultural advice. This is by email, and asking him if he has seeds that I could borrow. It's actually the late 90s, not the early 90s, summer of 96. And I'm in correspondence with Jim, and then I get word that he's been arrested, and that a SWAT team with 20 guys in black ninja suits busts into his apartment, throws him up against the wall, and arrests them. And the evidence is perfectly legal stuff. He's got a box of poppy heads, dried poppy heads, that he bought at a florist shop in Seattle. Every florist shop in the world has these things because they're quite beautiful. I have some back there. And so how could they prove that he had intent to manufacture a narcotic? Because this is the weird wrinkle in the law. It's legal to grow Papaver somniferum as long as you don't know that you're growing a scheduled substance, in which case, if they can prove that state of knowledge, you are breaking the law. This is in the United States. I don't know if it's quite the same in Britain. So the proof that that's what he was doing was contained in his book. So the book was used to indict the growing of the poppies. And I realized when this happened to him, and they really did wreck his life. He got off eventually. A judge threw this out, but he had to spend a lot of money, and it really was damaging to him. It was a horrible miscarriage of justice. I realized I was in the same boat. I was growing Papaver somniferum with the intent of making opium, and they could prove it because I was in his hard drive on his computer, asking for horticultural advice, and I owned a copy of his book. So that led to a summer of fear and paranoia, the likes of which I've never experienced. I'm growing the poppies, trying to determine if I'm really at risk, and I start doing some investigative journalism, and I gradually learn that indeed the Drug Enforcement Administration, we have a whole police force that just deals with drugs. It's a legacy of the drug war, that they are going around to nurseries and seed sellers and discouraging them from selling something that's perfectly legal. They're busting a handful of people for growing poppies, and they are basically trying to quietly squash what they think could be a big fad. And it's clear that this, they're also going around the florist shops and telling them not to sell dried poppy heads, which again are perfectly legal. They were not within their rights to do this. So anyway, I write the article. It ends up being kind of this long parable of the drug war, and I learn along the way what powerful tools they have to wreck one's life, and that includes what's called asset forfeiture. If your property is involved in the commission of a drug crime, the government can seize it, even if they don't prove that you knew about it or that you were guilty of anything. Your property can be guilty. I mean, our civil liberties have been badly eroded by the drug war. That's another one of the consequences that is just so regrettable. Anyway, after I published the article, I submit it to Harper's. They're all ready to publish it, but then they submit it to a lawyer at my request, and the lawyer was a criminal defense lawyer. And he reads the article, drives up to our house in the country in Connecticut, and says, "Look, you can't publish this article. It's a confession to a crime. It's very easy to date to this year, and it's very easy to tie to this place because you're describing your garden. And I cannot advise you to publish this." And I was a freelance writer, depending on this paycheck. Anyway, when the publisher of Harper's got wind of this, he was outraged and went out and got a new lawyer. And this time it was a First Amendment lawyer instead of a criminal defense lawyer. And this lawyer said, "You must publish this piece for the good of the Republic, because this is exactly what the First Amendment exists to protect, which is critical speech about the government." So I didn't know what to do between the two of them. And ultimately, I learned from this First Amendment lawyer that the two most provocative passages to the government was the one where I described exactly how to turn poppy heads into tea, the recipe, and then the so-called trip report, where I describe how the tea made me feel. And he said you could reduce your risk substantially by eliminating those two passages. So I boulderdized my own article and took them out, and we published it, and nothing happened. And I've always wanted to publish it in its correct form and right that wrong. And the other reason I wanted to publish it is we've learned in the years since that something else was going on in the summer of 1996. And that was the year that Purdue Pharma, the pharmaceutical company owned by the Sackler family, introduced Oxycontin, this new opiate that they claimed was less addictive and safer than opiates before, and knowing full well that this was not the case. And this is really what led to the opioid crisis. So it was a lesson to me about the limitations of journalism and the importance of history, and that to a journalist, the important drug story of that year was this quiet campaign to crush opium growing. Right. But of course, the real deeper story, which none of us were aware of, was the seeds of the opioid crisis were being planted legally by this corporation.
What changed that made you think it's okay to publish these paragraphs now?
Well, a couple things. The statute of limitations had passed. So after a certain number of years, you can confess to, just about anything but murder, and they can't get you. So, this was many years, 25 years later. So there was no risk. But also the atmosphere has changed. I would not hesitate to publish that piece or describe. I mean, look, in This Is Your Mind on Plants and in this book, and in the previous book, I do describe illegal activity. And I just think that there's much less risk right now, that the government is much less interested in making an example of a writer around drugs.
So looking at the kind of the Sackler family and OxyContin, could a skeptic about the legalization of drugs point at what happened with the opiate crisis and say, look at what happens when these drugs are legal and controlled by big business? It leads to the opiate crisis. I mean, does that weaken the position of people like us who are trying to argue for the legalization of drugs? Yeah,
I mean, I have a real problem with the commercialization of drugs. I in the case of psychedelics, I don't think they should be commercialized. I think it's going to be hard to avoid. But I think when capitalism gets a hold of these things, they tend to, look at what's happening with cannabis now. well, you can't see it until you come to California, but you will see it then, which is billboards in our cities promising to deliver cannabis to your door within an hour if you just call this number or go to this website. So we are having cannabis pushed on us in a very aggressive way, and it's being packaged in new ways. It's being, put into candy, which strikes me as a really stupid thing to do for many reasons. So I have real questions. I think if we are going to decriminalize it, which is different than legalizing it, you can decriminalize it and remove the penalties, but not allow for manufacture. And then there'll still be a black market in manufacture, but you're not putting the muscle of capitalism behind it. Yet you're not removing the black market, which you want to do also. So, you look at Portugal, where they've decriminalized drugs, and what's the role of the government? Or Switzerland, where heroin addicts, get prescriptions from the government. The government actually supplies them heroin, which is safer than street heroin because you know exactly what the dose is and it's not contaminated. Clean needles. And then they don't try to get you off the drug until they've changed your underlying circumstances, making sure you have a good job, good housing, good therapy, and then they try to get you off the drug. But in that case, the government is now in the heroin business, and that's awkward too. So I don't have the answers to what this drug piece is going to look like, but I think we know enough to be concerned that the promotion of drugs by corporations could be a lot worse than the promotion of drugs by drug dealers who don't have billboards, and don't have advertising.
They don't bother putting it into gummy bears.
No.
So let's look at the second plant, caffeine, coffee, and tea. Your thesis in a nutshell is that caffeine helped to shape modern capitalist civilization by helping us just be on it and industrious. Could you just unpack that for us? Yeah,
sure. So caffeine is a really interesting drug to study historically because unlike the other big categories of drugs, unlike the opiates or cannabis or alcohol, which have been around till from prehistory, we don't really know what a world innocent of those things looked like. Caffeine doesn't show up in Europe until the 1650s. It arrives in London that decade. Coffee, tea, and chocolate all show up the same decade. It was a very good decade. And so we can see what England and Europe in general looked like before and after. And the before was pretty drunken. People were drinking all the time. Alcohol was safer than water. You gave diluted alcohol or hard cider to your children because it was safer than water. And it was, people were buzzed or drunk a lot of the time. There were beer breaks on farms, and alcohol consumption was just, intense. Caffeine comes along, and it obviously doesn't displace alcohol. People in England, I understand, still drink, but it did shrink its hold on the populace. And you have people writing at the time about this new sober and civil drink, which is so much better for, the office workers, and that this new sobriety was a boon to business by and large. And you see a change of consciousness that is ushered in, and you see it in the coffee houses. In London, there's this explosion of coffee houses beginning in the 18th century, and there's one for every 200 Londoners. And the conversation in these coffee houses is substantially different than the conversation in a tavern. For one thing, all classes mix in coffee houses. They were a place where there weren't different rooms for different classes. Everybody, and when I say everybody, I mean men, because women were not admitted to coffee houses early on. And that the conversation was about work or cultural interest. And there was a coffee house associated with the Royal Institution where the scientists would come, Isaac Newton was there, and Francis Bacon, and then there was another one or a couple in Covent Garden tied to the literary crowd. And then there were ones for businessmen and insurance brokers that then became Lloyd's of London. So it fostered a new kind of conversation. And even people have argued changes in English prose, a more conversational style of writing, with people like Defoe and Dryden and Pope. Rhythms of English conversation start seeping into literature, which before was incredibly formal and it was all King James Bible kind of syntax. So much changes, and much of it for the good. And you have a drug that is just very well suited to the rise of to an industrial revolution, because people can operate heavy machinery more safely when they're not drunk. They can stay up later. You can have a second shift or even a third shift. They can do double entry bookkeeping and mental work that doesn't go down very well when you're drunk. So this is a tremendous boon to capitalism. Yes. And obviously there are other things going on. There's, light, electric light, and or gas light. There's coal, and there's technological inventions. So I don't want to have overly essentialist interpretation. But caffeine, I think, is very important to the rise of capitalism.
And you use the expression that caffeine helps the reconsolidation of the self, which is kind of like the opposite of the ego dissolution you talked about with psychedelics. And I noticed that 1650 is kind of like the decline of mysticism, and it kind of goes underground until the Romantics discover like hashish and mescaline. So, it's kind of part of this rise of rationalism and the decline of it clears away the shadows.
I think you're exactly right about that. So I see drugs on a kind of spectrum, with some of them kind of ego fortifying and nurturing individualism and a sense of separateness and rationalism and focus and linear thinking and abstraction. And then on the other side, you have a set of drugs, the psychedelics especially, but not just them, that soften ego boundaries, that encourage mystical thinking or magical thinking. And that, yes, and psychedelics are at one end of the spectrum, and caffeine and cocaine are at the other. These are ego drugs. And egos are very useful for getting stuff done. Obviously, they're important tools, important voices, but they don't have a lot of patience for mysticism. They're not, or spiritualism for that matter, of all kinds. Mm-hmm. So I think that drugs offer us tools to enhance certain tendencies that we have. And when I talked about the consolidation of self, it was this sense I had when I abstained from caffeine for 3 months. That was my experiment for that chapter. And I found that, whenever we wake up in the morning, we're kind of disassembled to a certain extent, frayed. And there's a process in getting up, and caffeine for me is central to it, of kind of knitting yourself back together, your sense of intentionality and purpose and drive. It doesn't naturally show up, at least for me. And caffeine is an indispensable ingredient in the construction of an ego.
And the construction of a writer too. I mean, we think about psychedelics as creativity inspiring, and yet you mention Balzac in your book, who wrote, I couldn't even get a concrete figure for how many books he wrote. No,
I couldn't either. It's like 54 or something. I'm not sure.
I counted 80 on his Wikipedia page. But so tell us about, because he really had a caffeine habit.
He did. And he believed that caffeine was essential to his creative process. And he drank huge amounts. And he got to the point where he thought the liquid form of caffeine was just too dilute for him. So he began consuming the coffee grounds. And he claimed, and he wrote about this, that the coffee grounds falling onto the villi, or whatever it's called, in your stomach was the best way to deliver the biggest dose. What this did to his stomach, I don't know. But he would stay up all night and write massive amounts, and he was convinced that his imagination needed the fuel of caffeine, of coffee, to to survive. And, many writers in this period are using caffeine. The Enlightenment writers, Voltaire, Diderot, big caffeine consumers. And I think it does contribute to that rationalist project in all sorts of ways, not to mention the heroic labors of someone, writing the first dictionary, the first encyclopedia on his own. And so, I think it was an important fuel. But I'm not convinced it's the best drug for creativity per se. The kind of the spotlight consciousness that caffeine encourages is very good for getting stuff done. It's very good for editing. But in terms of like creativity, sometimes you need a less focused mind. You need a daydreaming mind, a wandering mind. What the psychologists sometimes call lantern consciousness, which is encouraged by psychedelics, of course. This, taking in of information from all these unexpected corners of reality without that narrow focus. So maybe you need a combination, and that, the creative process is complicated, and a lot of creative work is editing and, refining and shaping, but often the impetus for it is a intuition or a chance thought that might be actually encouraged by psychedelics.
So I want to get on to psychedelics for the last 10 minutes or so. Just very briefly, for those who didn't read your last book, How to Change Your Mind, why would someone want to take a psychedelic drug?
Well, I think people have a variety of reasons. Curiosity about your mind, I would put, for me, high on the list. You learn things about yourself, whether you want to or not. And some of them are unpleasant. But, these molecules don't contain narrative. They don't contain images. They don't contain memories. They're catalysts, and they reveal things. The word psychedelic, coined by Humphrey Osmond, the English psychiatrist, means mind manifesting. It brings things to the surface or into the space of our conscious awareness. And so curiosity, self-discovery is one reason. Healing is another. Many people now are taking psychedelics to heal. And we have now, an impressive body of evidence that they're successful in helping people deal with depression and anxiety and obsession and addiction. So that's another reason that people would take it. And some people, I think, take it in low doses to just enhance ordinary experience, to enhance music. They do have very interesting effects on your senses, and they can intensify the pleasure in something like music.
So in your last book, you tried magic mushrooms, a substance that you get from a frog, I think, called
5-MeO-DMT, yes, from the Sonoran desert toad.
This time you wanted to try peyote and San Pedro, which contain the psychedelic mescaline. And initially your plan was to go to a ritual in a Native American church. And there is this church, existed for the last 100 years or so, where it's legal to take peyote within a religious ritual. Could you tell us just a bit about that church? I think many people will be surprised that there is such a church.
Yeah, so Native Americans have the legal right, and have had it since 1994, to use peyote, this cactus that contains mescaline, in their religious observances. They fought very hard and very long to get that right, which is ironic given that, white Europeans came to America for religious freedom and then crushed the religious freedom of the people who were already there. Irony is too gentle a word for that. But so Native Americans rediscovered peyote. Peyote had been used in the New World at least 6,000 years ago. We have found archaeological evidence of peyote use in southern Texas on the Rio Grande. But it had fallen away. Some tribes knew about it, some didn't. But in the 1880s, which is a moment of maximum suffering and trauma for Native Americans. This is a time when the US government's official policy is to destroy Indian culture, outlaw their rituals, force them onto reservations, take nomadic people who move with the bison and turn them into agriculturalists on shitty land in Oklahoma, forcing tribes together who didn't necessarily get along, kidnapping the children of Indians, cutting their hair, which is the worst thing you can do, and putting them in boarding schools with the express purpose of killing the Indian and saving the man. This was the avowed purpose of these boarding schools. So it was just a time where the Indian culture was on the verge of complete annihilation. They discover or rediscover peyote then, and a new religion is formed. And this is, it wasn't yet called the Native American Church, but they found that peyote was very helpful in healing people who were struggling with the trauma of their existence, especially alcoholism, which as soon as the reservations are established becomes a tremendous problem for Indians who had no experience metabolizing alcohol and were really vulnerable to it. And so they start meeting, and this ceremony forms. It's a very carefully choreographed, very rigid ceremony where everyone is in a teepee around a fire. There is a roadman who's like the shaman, but then there's a cedar man who's handling and a fire chief and a water carrier. There are all these roles. Everyone sits Indian style, staring at the fire. You don't get up, and you're there all night long. And there is one person who is the focus of the ceremony. This is a person struggling with trauma or alcoholism or spousal abuse or whatever it is. Everyone, they're passing the peyote buttons. They're little buttons of cactus that you eat. They're spineless cacti. And everyone's attention is focused on that person and healing that person. And a certain collective consciousness forms on the peyote, and the peyote is, like psychedelics can be. Indians I interviewed describe it as a mirror. You see yourself in it, and you see what's wrong with yourself. And with the support of the group, you start writing a new narrative about yourself, a narrative of rebirth, really. And there are 250,000 members of this church now, and it's proven very valuable in sustaining Indian culture, healing that culture's trauma. And it's a beautiful phenomenon in many ways. And I found it striking because it's such a different image of what a psychedelic is. You know, in the West, we think of psychedelics as disruptive to culture and society, as they were in the 60s, for good or bad, but they were disruptive. Here is an example of a profoundly conservative use of a psychedelic, where it's reaffirming society and the community. And that I think that tells us that it's really all about set and setting and expectation and the context, that the same drugs in a different context can perform a very different role. And that's one of the reasons I was so interested in exploring the indigenous use of psychedelics, which was not a part of How to Change Your Mind.
And your plan to take part in rituals disrupted partly by the pandemic and the lockdown, but also it seems like you got a sense that maybe just, it would be, I don't know, cultural appropriation in some way, or just leave that particular substance. I was interested to hear that the Native American Church doesn't want peyote to be included in the decriminalized nature movement.
Yes.
They oppose that.
There's a battle there.
Yeah. So you decided not to take part in a Native American
church.
The
reason I didn't, and I did have invitations to participate in a ceremony. There was the pandemic, but even now, when it might be possible, there is a shortage of peyote. The Native American Church has grown. The lands where peyote grows, very narrow band on both sides of the Rio Grande. But on the American side, it's much smaller. And the population of wild peyote is crashing. It's not easy to grow. It takes 15 years from seed to usable button. There's development where it grows. There's cattle ranching. So there's a conservation story here too that's very important. And I came to the conclusion after interviewing a great many Native Americans that the best way to show respect for this ritual and is not to use it. I mean, that we have taken enough from Native Americans, and to take this too by making it popular, by having a fad for peyote, would just be the worst thing possible. So, and there are other ways. If you're interested in mescaline, you can find synthetic mescaline, or there's another cactus called San Pedro, which grows, I have growing in my garden. It's legal to grow. It also produces mescaline in lesser amounts, but you can turn that into a tea and get your mescaline that way. So yeah, I think as a white American, leaving peyote alone is the right thing to do, at least for me.
And the book ends with you taking San Pedro in a group, different to how to change your mind, or your experiences are individual experiences, or maybe guided. But this is a group collective trip with your wife as well. And I thought it was very beautiful and moving description about how you're all kind of participating in each other's healing.
Yeah, I had never done any kind of group psychedelic work, and it's a very interesting dynamic, at least on mescaline, which is a kind of more social psychedelic than others. It's very easy to converse. You're aware of other people. And I thought this would be about me, this experience, like most of my psychedelic trips have been, but it wasn't. It was about my wife, Judith. And there was a group of us, and we were being led by a shaman, although she wouldn't call her that. She would call herself a wachumara, or a medicine carrier. But it's the same basic idea. And she had a lot of experience administering this in groups. And, there's this interesting phenomenon where you all get on sort of the same psychic wavelength. But it was clear that one person, Judith, was struggling, and she was having a very big experience, and mine was milder. And the attention moved to her, and the shaman's attention moved to her also. And she was struggling with an issue having to do with her mother, and who was dying at the time, and a burden she was carrying from her father, who died years ago. And I mean, without going into details, she needed to let something go. And with the support of the group and this medicine, and it's not a powerful medicine. I mean, it's fairly mild, but it does soften the boundaries of individuals, such that we were like kind of in sync. And she found it enormously helpful. And it was and a ceremony that wasn't about me was exactly what I needed, to move my focus off my own stuff and onto hers. So it was a beautiful ceremony. And it suggests another way to use psychedelics, or at least this psychedelic. I don't think it's an accident that it's used in groups by Indians too. There is a kind of, a consciousness that develops that's greater than the sum of its parts.
There's lots I'd love to ask you, but I'm conscious I want to give time to our audience. So I just want to ask a last one, which is, since your book came out, How to Change Your Mind, in 2018, it's been an extraordinary 3 years in the kind of world of psychedelics. It's gone from countercultural to suddenly like big business, hedge funds, IPOs, billion-dollar valuations. It's really just gone extraordinary. And I think, some of that was the caused by your book as well. So I know one mushroom retreat center in Holland, and they talk about the pollen effect after your book came out. The number of people applying to go to their retreat rocketed up. So I guess I'd just like to ask, what do you think of this so-called shroom boom? And I mean, do you ever feel a sense of trepidation, like, what have I done? Yeah. So just which of course you're not responsible for psychedelic capitalism at all, but what are your feelings on it?
Well, there is a gold rush happening right now, and I think somebody just told me there are 350 companies now wanting to get into the psychedelic space. none of them have a very good idea how to make money there. And I think many of them will crash and burn. It's, even the company with the $1 billion valuation that you mentioned hasn't really figured out a business model. It's not easy to figure out how you're going to make money on psychedelic therapy. When you consider that psilocybin therapy, is going to be 1 or 2 pills. How do you sell 1 or 2 pills for enough money to justify the investment? This is, the pharmaceutical industry is based on drugs you take every day for the rest of your life. They love drugs that don't cure you, basically. Yeah. And psilocybin, when it works, actually cures you. And then there's all the therapeutic support you need. It's not just the pill, you need a package. So much remains to be figured out about the business model. I think that, some of the investment is going to lead to really valuable research, and it costs a lot of money to bring a drug to market. And the value of going through this approval process with the FDA and the EMA is that it will then presumably, if it does work, be available to people and covered by insurance. And that will make it accessible. Right now, it's the rich who can afford guided psychedelic therapy, and the prices of which have gone through the roof in the last 3 years because the demand is outstripping the supply. Mm. In terms of feeling responsible, I mean, as a writer, you can't. I mean, ripples come out of your work that you can't control. I'm very careful to talk about risks and not be too evangelical about the benefits of psychedelics, even though I do think they have important benefits in the right context. I hear, though, people write to me with some horror stories. I mean, things have gone really very wrong for some people. But those emails and letters are vastly outnumbered by the people who write to say how their lives have been improved. And that makes me feel really good. I mean, that somebody took a step that helped them deal with a problem they were having, and many people have been healed. So on balance, I think these are positive developments. I think that there will be, over exuberance, as there always are, as there always is. But in addition to all the corporate money, there's a ton of philanthropic money that's going into supporting the research, because there's no government money supporting these drug trials. It's all private money. And there are all these new research centers. There's one at Harvard, there's one at Yale, there's now we just started one at Berkeley, where I teach. And really brilliant minds are applying themselves to what psychedelics has to teach about not just how to cure mental illness, but understand consciousness, understand the brain mechanisms behind perception. So I'm very excited that we're going to learn a lot, and that on balance, this is a positive direction for society, I think. And, there could be a backlash, things could go wrong, but they are, I think the potential for good is exciting enough to take the risks.